Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Frances Widdowson, who was a professor at Mount Royal University until her speech against the totalitarian tact that her fellow faculty were taking on behalf of anti-racist maneuvers with regard to Black Lives Matter and various indigeneity narratives up in Canada went astray of the orthodoxy, and she was summarily fired under very suspicious circumstances and with a very asymmetric dispensation of justice. In this conversation, we talk about her case. She is indeed taking the Mount Royal University to task for her treatment, and we talk about what happened to her and her thoughts in general about the present day state of the university system in Canada. Links to her case and to other materials are down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Frances Widdowson. Hello?
Hello there.
Hello there. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Pretty good.
I can't believe I'm talking to you.
To me?
Yep.
Why would you say such a thing?
I don't know. I watched you so much from afar that it's kind of amazing that I'm actually in the seat here and talking to you.
Well, you did what you had to do. You did what you had to do to get on my show. Like, implode your career, right? Just to get...
That's right. No, well, yeah, well, maybe not. Maybe I could have been, but I guess not. Yeah. You know, it's kind of sad. Oh, well, whatever. Yeah. So it's inevitable. It was inevitable.
Was it?
Yes. Yeah. It's like Brett Weinstein. It was inevitable.
Yeah. Well,
I think in the current context.
Yeah, in the current context, for sure.
I am currently going through massive arbitration process, which has already done 10 days and is going to do 6 more sessions. May, June, November, and December.
Okay.
I need to be reinstated at Mount Royal. If I'm not reinstated at Mount Royal, universities are over in Canada because my case is got nothing to do with any other things besides academic matters and matters of freedom of expression.
Okay.
That's what it's all about. The whole thing is about now, of course, Mount Royal is trying to, kind of imply that it was due to my harassing and discriminatory and toxicity, my toxic behavior.
Okay. Yeah.
But that was just a kind of a bit of a smokescreen for what is going on in universities right now. So I should be able to be reinstated, because I haven't done anything in the workplace at all, and everything about the workplace has just been made up. But with the current woke situation, who knows what is going to happen? So
they're painting you as a witch, necessarily.
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. Okay. Oh, and it's the stakes are very high. I'm amazed at how high the stakes are, which right up until the very end, December 2021. I thought the university would pull back. I did, because I thought it was so ridiculous, the whole thing that had gone on, that I thought there's just no way they're going to fire me, because this is like, universities are rational places in the end. If you just make the arguments clearly enough, strongly enough, most comprehensively enough.
Yeah.
As well, one of my colleagues, starting in 2019, said to me, you are now entering into very controversial areas. You should make sure that every time you say something publicly, you record what you are saying, because you are going to get nailed. They are going to nail you. And I said, okay. Well, first of all, I was going, no, that's not necessary. This is a bit exaggerated. But then I did go and I bought a recorder, and actually it's quite amusing because I was on my way to a talk and I bought a recorder on the way there and I recorded that talk. And in that talk, I asked a question, and that question became the subject of a harassment investigation. And if I had not recorded that question, I could have had some difficulties from that question that I asked. So I have for a number of years, I have been recording things, fortunately, because now I am able to some extent show that a lot of the things that are being argued are made up by various people. So this is going to be an important part of the whole story.
Well, is there any significant difference? It seems to me on an intuitive level that there's a difference between saying something offensive, right, or taking a position, or arguing a position as a devil's advocate, which is what I do sometimes when I ask questions, and people interpret that in the comments of my videos as me taking a position when that's just not my job. My job is to get the position out of somebody else by presenting them with alternative positions. But so there's making an argument, devil's advocate, or sincere argument that's offensive. But then there's this thing called asking a question, and that being harassing. Is that just a continuum of discourse, or is there's something different about asking a question leading to harassment? Like, how can I ask you a question? I guess I could talk about your body, or imply something racial about you through a questioning. Thing. But.
Yeah, no, this was a very interesting development that happened because I thought that would save me just asking questions. And actually, that's what I did on Twitter for most of my Twitter life until I became satirical in my approach. Before I became satirical, I would just use Twitter to ask questions.
Okay.
But my colleagues thought this was very offensive, me asking questions, because they thought that my questions were relentless. So that was one of the accusations. So they were relentless. I would ask follow-up questions and so on.
Wait, relentless questioning? That's a harassment thing?
Relentless, and asked with ill intent. That was the other claim. So, and this was because when I often would be asking questions, I was doing so to point out to the audience what I considered to be some of the inconsistencies and irrational characteristics of this position.
You know what? Okay, I guess I was feigning. I was being kind of naive about, like, questions can get you in trouble. You think back at the foundation of the academy in the garden of academe. You got this guy asking questions named Socrates that ends up getting killed by the state. So I guess it's always been kind of part and parcel to ask questions.
It is, and in fact, it almost is seen as more problematic, if you can use that word, in the sense that people kind of suspect that you have some hidden agenda that you are hiding with your questions. Like, this is sort of the thing. And it was quite funny how I sort of progressed through my questioning, because people would try to thwart me with my questions. And they would, if I asked a couple questions, they would sort of extract one of them. So I would have to kind of hone my questions to just get a very short question and not have a follow-up, just so that it wouldn't like cause all this kind of anger about me being relentless. So one of them was, this was a good example. So I had a lot of problems with the indigenization file, with the indigenous scholar activists getting upset about their quote unquote way of knowing being challenged. This was a big issue. And if you would ask questions about this, this would be seen as being colonialist and racist and so on and so forth. But anyway, this one scholar activist was giving a talk on various things. And one of the things she was talking about was indigenous epistemologies. And epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. And it's claimed that the indigenous way knowing things is got different kinds of characteristics, but it's never very clear what the different characteristics are that allow this knowledge, quote unquote, knowledge system to come into existence. And usually it's got something to do with supernatural beliefs in the supernatural and with
nature.
The idea that Indigenous people, because of their what's perceived to be their relationship with the Creator, they have an understanding that people who are not Indigenous do not have, because of the Creator is not communicating with us the same way it is communicating with Indigenous people with Indigenous ancestry. That's kind of a hidden kind of thing that's going on. But of course, that's not really a knowledge system. These are all sort of beliefs, spiritual beliefs that are not knowledge, but it's called knowledge. Anyway, so when she's talking away, and I couldn't understand what she was talking about, but I wanted to get to what this Indigenous epistemologies were, what they were. So the question was, and I made a really short question, how do Indigenous epistemologies distinguish between true and false beliefs? That was the question. And of course, that was, although I was just about to be fired. That question was put forward about a week before I got fired. But I'm sure that was seen as being harassing, because it was hidden in that question was an attempt to try to get some explanation for whether we're concerned about searching for the truth here or not, or whether it's different truths for different groups, these kinds of considerations. So that was that question. Yeah. But this time she did not become angry about this. She just did this long, kind of incomprehensible response. And then in the end, basically said, something is true if I believe it's true. That was basically the final conclusion, which in a university, if we're going to go that route, that means, you can pretty much say anything and claim it's knowledge and no one's going to be able to contest.
Well, you can claim anything, but you can question nothing.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you can't question some things, and it's generally kind of, now it's known. It's becoming known as to what you can't question, but it's never stated, no, you can't question that. It's more people getting angry at you and calling you a bully and like all these kind of names, because you are just there asking these relentless questions, trying to get to the bottom of, are we talking about different truths, or are we talking about one truth that we're all trying to engage in the search for? So that incident, she didn't get angry about that. But then a couple months later, after I'd been fired, actually, I showed up to another event on Zoom about epistemicide and land-based learning was the topic.
Epistemicide? Is that like what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, or what?
So this raises a question about what these things are and how they're related to one another. And so my question was, because there's all this talk about epistemicide, all this talk about land-based learning, and neither of those two things is very clear as to what they are. And I guess I could have asked, what is epistemicide, or what is land-based learning, or like whatever. But I decided, okay, I just want to kind of get this out here about these terms. And my question was, how is epistemicide related to land-based learning? Like, what is the relationship between epistemicide and land-based learning? Anyway, this scholar activist, by this question, became very upset and said this was an example of arrogance and cultural narcissism, or arrogance, narcissism, this sort of thing. It was like the assumption that the scientific method is the one way to find the truth. And this is, and there's this long diatribe that went on, basically castigating me for my, I'm not exactly sure what, but my question, asking that question, was somehow an indication that I was an arrogant person who was narcissistically engaged in, trying to puff myself up by claiming that my truth was superior to
That's exactly what this person's doing, though. They're totally projecting their project onto you.
So this is the kind of thing that's going on now, right?
Yeah.
So I just, it's just an impossible situation for if you are an academically minded person who wants to try to figure things out and wants to have clear terms and wants to see if there's evidence to support this particular position. There's certain areas now where trying to ask those kinds of questions about these woke issues is seen as being highly suspect and is going to get you into a harassment investigation at some point. You're going to be kind of singled out for being a person who's not really got the memo. You did not get the memo that these things have been decided already, and this is what is considered now to be the right way to think. And if you are questioning that, that is an indication that you don't really belong in this institution. And actually, Mount Royal University's slogan is "You belong here." That is their slogan.
How long has that been their slogan? Is that new?
It's been a number of years.
Okay.
Probably, definitely 5 years, maybe longer. Okay. I didn't really notice it. I didn't notice it to begin with. I started at Mount Royal in 2008. I've been in the university system since 1997 as a PhD student. And that was very much, that's why I went into the university, because I thought that I had some ideas that were true that were being suppressed in the government. So I worked in the government for 5 years and then had some problems in the government due to my attempts to tell the truth with respect to this indigenous ways of knowing area. And I could sort of I thought that was unfortunate, but I thought, hey, if I'm going to tell the truth, I got to go into the university system, because that's where you tell the truth, is in the university system. And then...
Well, where do you think not telling the truth comes from? The government or the university? I mean, which is further up the stream?
Well, many argue it's the university that was like there's an interaction between the two, but many say it started in the universities in the 1960s is the claim, which I think there is some merit to, although there might be other factors involved. Basically, we had two factors happening that allowed this state of affairs to unfold. One is what is called postmodernism. The other is called identity politics. So those two things, and they're like, and often they get kind of mixed up with one another. But I think that they are. The more I think about it, the more I think they're two different beasts. But postmodernism made it possible for identity politics to gain a foothold in the university. And once identity politics gained a foothold in the university, it was over. We didn't think it was when it first started happening, because we thought, hey, this is just one kind of perspective amongst many, and you don't have to accept it if you don't agree with it. And then the people who are identity politics proponents, they're activists, so they work hard in trying to make sure that their position is going to be the one position, the only position that exists. But because postmodernism, which is the prizing of subjectivity over objectivity. So it's an attack on the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is the idea we're individuals with autonomously kind of reasoning subjects, and we look for evidence and use logic to try to become closer to the truth, or to search for the truth. That sort of idea of the Enlightenment. Postmodernism was an assault on that. It was a direct assault on that, and argued that there's no such thing as a universal truth, that it's just sort of subjective beliefs, and whoever has the most power is able to declare their subjective beliefs as being the objective truth. Anyway, when that kind of sentiment took hold, was accepted within the university, it kind of opened up this corridor for identity politics to insert itself, largely in these what James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, their grievance studies, kind of like these grievance studies areas, these advocacy studies areas, that's where they kind of took root, was in those areas. But now those areas have taken over the machinery of the institution. So you now have these diversity, inclusion, and equity offices, and you have Indigenous centers and all these kinds of like activist-oriented administrative structures that are forcing all professors to accept these views. And if you don't, you're gonna have harassment. You're gonna have investigations of various kinds.
Yeah.
And I've been through 5 myself.
I might propose a distasteful phrase to you to kind of sum up this collective metastasizing force under the banner of bureaucratic ways of knowing. These ways of knowing, or ways of being, ways of speaking, ways of organizing are particularly suited to the bureaucratic institution, not necessarily the epistemic knowledge production purpose or the telos of truth in the university, but rather this organization that was built nominally to pursue the truth is now just being re-engineered to serve itself. And the bureaucratic ways of knowing and identity politics is just basically, if you can reduce everybody into a checklist, we can organize everybody and we can force everybody to organize everybody else through this very efficient seeming system that will deal with all of the moral problems of the universe, will deal with all of the subjective problems of human experience by regulating it. And so it gives the bureaucracy a lot more power and a lot more influence. And whoever works their way up in the bureaucracy is already attuned to bureaucratic ways of knowing and then hires and extends the bureaucratic apparatus, kind of almost as a functionary of the bureaucratic apparatus. So it might be the case that the entire institution is shit because it's lost its telos other than itself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was just listening to a talk put on by the National Association of Scholars, which is a very, very important organization in the United States. And I think his name's Daryl Paul is the academic's name. I'd heard of him before, but I was just fascinated by this talk he was giving on diversity. A managerialist ideology was the name of the talk. And it's like, I was just watching it before I came on, and I'm going to watch it again because there's a lot of ideas in there. And he was talking about the economic system, the capitalist system. And there's, from a Marxist perspective, there's owners and non-owners. So that's the major split. But then if you want to go into it a little bit more, there's what he calls managers and professionals in the system who are not owners like Bill Gates or, Jeff Bezos and all these billionaires and everything, who are the owners of the system. But they're the managers and the professionals who take up a kind of what would in Marxist terms would be called the petty bourgeois position. So like a kind of the in-between kind of management kind of thing, which, kind of doesn't own, but it acts to, keep the workers from rising up and all sorts of other things. Yeah. Anyway, I was just fascinated by this because, I'm trying to figure this out myself as to all these, bureaucrats within the university, what is called diversicrats, these people who work in diversity kinds of areas within the university and send out all sorts of, guidelines as to how you're supposed to behave and this and that. And they are, they're using wokism, this whole woke identity politics stuff. You're using it. The question is whether are they believers in it themselves, or do they just see it as a handy, arbitrary strategy? So, why wokism, I think, has been so successful, and wokism, in my view, is identity politics that has become totalitarian. So, like, that's the nature of wokism. It's identity politics stuff, but it's not just everyone has their different position in a university, and identity politics is one of those positions. It's no, this is the only position, and if you don't accept it, you're gonna have trouble. So, identity politics that has become totalitarian. The administrators and the managers like the kind of totalitarian aspect of this, and they can impose it more easily because of wokism's victimhood stance that it takes on. So this happened to me time and time again.
Yeah.
With these trans activists or indigenous scholar activists, these people within the university, they go after you and try to get you fired and do all this, right? And you react. And when you react to them, they immediately use their victim status to say that you are oppressing them and you are a this and a that, and you are, and it's like, well, you are the one going after me. I'm trying to do my academic thing here and just raise some questions about what I perceive to be somewhat dubious claims. You're getting upset about it. You're trying to get students mobilized and trying to go to the president to do something about my questioning and so on. Yeah. And then when I kind of mildly satirize your efforts to do this, you say I'm a person who's oppressed and this is someone who's going after me and all, which is kind of like turning everything around as to what's happened. So because there's this victim kind of stance, that the totalitarian impulse can be imposed in a much more sneaky way. So because I know people who will accept the totalitarianism of things under the auspices that, well, what's the harm in going along with this, because the people that it's going to help have been oppressed for, hundreds of years, those kinds of things.
Well,
like
I mean, does it really help them? Does it really help the indigenous people to allow them to get a very small narcissistic band of so-called indigenous studies professors losing their... I mean, okay, so going back to the question, do these people really believe in this? Is it possible for that activist professor that got mad at you, is it possible that she can believe in what she's saying without some sort of epistemic coherence and consistency? Is it possible for her to even have a belief, or is she just churning?
Well, it seems that she does. I think I've kind of, sat across the table, and I don't think it's sat across the table from the indigenous scholar activists.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a made up thing. I think part of it is a bit because they are constantly encouraged. Like, they don't hear any, the people who surround them are constantly, involved in a love bombing kind of process where they're just constantly, whatever is said, agreement and enthusiasm, not just agreement, but enthusiastic agreement is what they receive. So I can really see how they would be believing what is being put forward. So I think I don't think it's dishonest. I think there's dishonest. The allies, many of the allies are not honest, but I don't think the activists themselves often are dishonest. I think they do believe it, just because they've just been socialized so much into that system that I think it would be really almost impossible for them to think otherwise, because the only people that they're going to get who are disagreeing with them are people that they've been told are disagreeing just because of their hatred of indigenous people. That's why why else would these people be disagreeing with you? It's because they obviously hate indigenous people. This is what is being said. So in the end, that's kind of what is going on.
I'm fishing for a way to counter this on its own terms. And insofar as it adopts certain postmodern techniques to destabilize truth, and then lets go of those when it starts to erode their own truth, when they get down to their own truth. And it's probably a case of, can they actually stop that? That's one question. So it will probably eventually erode itself. But to encounter it on its own terms, in order to, bypass the sincerity of their belief, in order to engage with them in the project of mutual truth, if that is even possible at this point. So have you had successes reaching people and entering into actually good faith dialogue?
No, it wasn't good. I decided satire was the way forward. Okay. That was a decision I made in 2020 when I realized that reason was not going to work. And actually it was Toby Young, who's the head of the Free Speech Union. He did mention, that's kind of what put the seed into my mind was, okay. He said that if you have people who are denying reason, will not accept reason, will not accept logic, will not accept that there is a universal truth, there is no way to rationally argue with people with that position. And so really it is, I'm not sure if he used the word satire, but he used the word kind of like using humor to, kind of, expose. Like it's kind of it's a process of exposure. And that's what I did. And it's kind of funny. So one of your guests that you've had on this program, which I watched, which I enjoyed immensely, is a person by the name of Andrew Doyle.
I knew you were going to bring him up.
Who I'm a big fan. Anyway, so I've been following the Titania McGrath kind of Twitter stuff, just and it gave me great comfort. Yeah, solace, because I could see it was done in he was so good at it that it sort of said someone else understands this and is not taking it seriously. And so I thought, hey, maybe I could do some of this. I could get in on this. And I decided to do this in July 2020, because what had happened is a bunch of woke colleagues at Mount Royal had decided to get on the whole George Floyd Black Lives Matter kind of thing that was going through the United States, when in Canada that's not really it's not really applicable in the same way. There's other things going on, but it's not really the same kind of thing. But they decided to use that to press for a whole bunch of initiatives like mandatory anti-racism training for all faculty members was one of the things. And then a whole bunch of resources were going to be diverted to various grievance studies types of initiatives. Yeah. So anyway, so I was watching this, and one of my colleagues, his name is Sinclair McRae, who's an incredibly thoughtful guy and also very kind and calm and never has a nasty word to say about anyone. So like I understand why people get a bit upset about my kind of, relentlessness and everything, but he's always asking, just truthfully trying to understand what's going on. He wrote this incredible letter in response to all this kind of politicization, saying, this is not going to be helpful to the university. It's going to be very harmful if we're going to do this. And we shouldn't be having these political statements being made, especially the faculty association, which is the union, was doing this as well and making all sorts of claims which were totally unsubstantiated and many false.
Such as?
Like that. There's a Black woman who had, she was in an apartment and the police, she had a mental health problem of some kind. The police were there and she tried to escape by jumping out off a balcony onto another balcony and fell to her death. It was tragic, but many people were arguing that the police had killed her and all these sorts of things. Anyway, the faculty association said that she had been murdered by police. Yeah. So we're going, this is very irresponsible for you to be saying these things, and especially the faculty association on behalf of members. Anyway, so Sinclair McRae wrote this great letter. I was just incredibly struck by how well argued it was. And it was totally ignored by everyone. Like all these woke people, this is like it didn't even exist. And I was going, like, how can the faculty association not look at that and say, hey, well, maybe we should not be doing this. But they just ignored it. So I thought, if no one's going to listen to Sinclair McCrae in his incredible argumentation and putting forth evidence and reasons and so on, then how am I going to do that better? So I'll take a satirical approach to this situation.
Uh-oh.
This was the beginning of the end. So on my Facebook page, I wrote a letter, an open letter to I just said, dear colleagues, in this open letter. But it wasn't meant for my colleagues. It was meant as a general, just to show that this was kind of ridiculous, the path that we were going along. So I said that George Orwell had come to me in a dream, and he had said to me, Frances, I know that you were a fan of my analysis of totalitarianism, but this is not the right way. The right way is postmodern intersectional theory. So, after praying to the Creator and doing a territorial land acknowledgement, posting my pronouns on Twitter, and adding a condemnation of racism to my syllabi, I have decided upon what the best path is for Mount Royal University. And I cannot sign the open letter because 62 people had signed this letter demanding mandatory anti-racism training and everything like that. 62 faculty members. I cannot sign that because open letters themselves are part of the cis white patriarchal system. What I propose instead, and then that's because the open letter J'accuse, which is written by Emile Zola, was written by a white cis man who was trying to uphold oppression through the liberal democratic kinds of political system, and that's just oppressive. A better, the best approach would be to develop an oppression point system where we will evaluate faculty members according to whether they are white. So you're going to get 1 point if you're white, 1 point if you're male, 1 point if you're cisgendered, and 1 point if you're a full professor. And those faculty members, since I know that the faculty members who signed that letter think that merit is a tool of the oppressor and so on, those that score high on the oppression point scale should, be principled in their activism and resign their positions to make room for all these BIPOC scholars who are trying to, elbow their way into the system. The manure pile. I think I called it sort of rise up the manure pile of hate. That is Mount Royal University. Anyway, that I signed it. Your humble and obedient big brother lover. Anyway, so this was like everyone saw that. That was everyone was kind of upset about that satirical letter that was, and I did the oppression point system. I applied it to all the 62 people, but I didn't use their names. I just blacked out their names. But you could see from the 62, I believe it was about 40% would have had to resign because they were highly privileged on the oppression point scale. Anyway, I was trying to kind of just point out the hypocrisy of people who were arguing for constantly hiring on the basis of these identity categories, something that I personally am opposed to, but this is what they're putting forward. And they were not being very principled. And there's not going to be enough positions opening up. It has to be, things have to be done more quickly, and this is the way to do it more quickly. Anyway, so I think satire is not it worked. It kind of brought the woke out of the woodwork in the satire. So that was the other problem that I was having, is that before the satire, I knew that there was mobilization happening against me, but I didn't know who anyone was who was doing it. It was all kind of mysterious. And then when I started doing the satire, that kind of emboldened the woke, and they all came out and they all started to try to, they were all engaged in various activities against me. So I actually mapped them out. As part of my defense, I took screen captures of all their activities, and I had about 40 people that I had identified as being part of this mob that were trying to take me out. So I was able to develop a better understanding of who was involved in the situation as well.
So you made a strong claim earlier about your case being some sort of linchpin with regard to Canadian universities. How exactly does it matter? Why are the stakes so high? And how is it formulated? Can you formulate what your case actually is and why it could act as a bulwark of the woke encroachment, or what? No.
So it's very rare in Canada for a tenured professor to be fired. That's the first thing. There have been a number of people who have been fired for various things, but their cases are slightly murky because there's other things involved as well. But with me, I never did anything like I was just doing this satirical stuff on Twitter, and therefore, and many of the things, there's some that was to do with the whole interactions with people who were trying to get me fired. That was one thing. But there was also, for example, one tweet where I satirized misgendering fatigue and the LGBT initialism. That was found to violate 3 policies and 2 laws.
Oh, 2 laws?
Yes. Alberta Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Alberta Human Rights Act.
OSHA came after you for making a joke about pronouns?
Yeah, well, it was anyway, because it was in response to, the whole story is, there was a board member for the Faculty Association who was going to be doing a workshop on how white supremacy culture was infusing the Faculty Association. That was going to be the workshop.
Okay.
Anyway, this was crazy. This was because the Faculty Association is the most woke of the woke, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can't be woke enough. That's why you have more things calling yourselves Nazis.
Anyway, so I'm going, what on earth? And white supremacy culture, of course, is things like objectivity. If you prize objectivity, it's part of white supremacy. It's like, no, this is the scientific method. The scientific method is not white supremacist. This is a ridiculous kind of thing. Anyway, so because I'd been alerting Mount Royal to the fact that I had been defamed on social media for 4 years, and Mount Royal had done nothing about it. I had assumed that social media was not a workplace matter for them, right? Which makes sense because Twitter is not work, right? Like you're going to your classes, teaching, you're doing research, you're going to events, you're going to meetings on campus. That's all work, but you're tweeting about, misgendering fatigue or whatever. That's just on your private time. And if someone's going to call me a pathetic racist, for example, on their own private time, then that's not at work. If they call me a pathetic racist at work, then that might be an issue. But since they're doing it on Twitter, then don't worry about it. No one ever told me about it. No one ever said, hey, Frances, you better watch your Twitter activity. No one ever said that or anything. I thought, well, there are 18 colleagues who have been engaged in far worse than me on social media against me. So I filed 18 complaints against my colleagues.
Okay.
Because if we're all going to be subjected to these rules, then everyone should be accountable the same way. And as I was never told what the policy was all about, then it doesn't matter whether they were told whether the policy was all about. So this is all, and at the time I was thinking, I'm happy to just drop everything, go back to the drawing board and rewrite some policies. And I don't want to pursue anyone about this. But until we get that sorted, I want everyone else at Mount Royal to be held to the same standard as me. when I filed these complaints, the same day that I filed the complaint again, or that this person heard about the complaint being filed against her, this person who's now left Mount Royal, who I can talk about, Renee Watchman, filed a complaint against me. Well, this one was a really amazing complaint.
Oh, cool.
It was 7 pages long.
Oh, wow.
And had 15 counts
of murder?
Of not capitalizing I in Indigenous.
Oh, okay.
Referring to diversity, inclusion, and equity as DIE, D-I-E. Asking questions at meetings. Giving a presentation at an academic conference. 14 out of the 15 were not found to be harassment. But the social media aspect, although the tweets and the that Watchman presented, the only one that got found to be harassing was the satirical letter. That was found to be harassing.
Because of the colleagues?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was saying, well, I didn't mention any of them. Like, it wasn't, none of them were identifiable. It was like a general kind of, to those professors who embrace wokism, like that was like, anyway. And then the investigator at this point, because I guess he believed that he didn't have enough to get me with just the satirical letter, he decided to go through my entire Twitter account.
Okay.
So he found that to be harassment and creating a toxic workplace environment. And these were tweets that had not referred to Renee Watchman at all. They were all more generic kinds of, satirizing the comparison of the residential schools that Jim McMurtry on your program was referring to were like the Holocaust. So, like saying that I was satirizing that idea, mm-hmm. and saying that Canada was even more of a fascist state than Nazi Germany because of the residential schools and these kinds of things. Francis McGrath was doing this. So that was found to be harassment and creating a toxic workplace environment because I was demeaning the viewpoints of my colleagues.
Okay. But they're not demeaning your viewpoints when they elevate it to harassment, right? I guess they're not demeaning it. They're hyperbolizing your statements, right?
Well, I think we find that the standard is not, when it's applied to me, is not the same as applied to the woke. Okay, so again, this is kind of woke logic that's going on. Well, and then number 4, so that was number 3, was Watchman. And number 4 was one of the complaints that I filed of the 18 was found to be frivolous and vexatious.
I'm sorry. So your complaints were dismissed.
So when I filed the 17, so I filed 17 to begin with. 6 were found to have harassed me. 6 of the 17. And then I filed another one because new developments had occurred, and that one was found to be frivolous and vexatious.
Okay. Which is another mark against you.
Yes. So that was strike number 4, I guess.
Okay.
And then that's when they decided that I was going to be fired. But then when I got my termination letter, they added a bunch of new things in there, like that I was a disruptor of meetings. And that complaints had been filed against me, like many students had filed complaints about me, which I assume was about my Twitter activities. I had ruined the reputation of Mount Royal University. And then my favorites, I refused to accept responsibility and show remorse.
Oh, at any point did they ask you for remorse?
Yeah, so for people who are interested in my case, I had a final disciplinary meeting with the provost on December 13th, 2021. I recorded that meeting and I posted it on my SoundCloud, and people could listen to the 1984 kind of
struggle session.
Yeah, that was a good one. Anyway, she was trying to ask me for if I accepted, did I accept responsibility for my actions, and did I show remorse? And I said, I can't accept responsibility for my actions because I was just reacting to people trying to get me fired. And I can't show remorse because no one ever let me know that what I was doing would be considered to be harassment. Like social media was never, it says in our collective agreement that we cannot be punished for violating a rule that we did not know existed.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what it says.
Yeah.
So I'm going, how would I know that there was a rule against social media, doing stuff on social media? Because, I'd had this happen to me for several years and been telling administration, and they were not doing anything about it. What it seemed to me was they were just sort of using arbitrariness to catch me at various things to kind of make a case for me to be fired, which is what we're supposed to be protected against. Like that's the whole idea behind all of our collective agreement. And it was that, everything you should know what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And this should all be spelled out in a clear way. This is all seems to me to be self-evident. And I explained this many, many times to administration, and they just didn't. It's like they never would respond to. So I really don't have any scores to settle with any of my colleagues or anything. I'm happy to coexist with them, and I've taken my direction from the provost. So as long as I know what the rules are, I'm happy to abide by whatever they are. But of course, they're not very clear about this. So I can easily go back into the university. It's not a problem. I haven't done anything. So that should be a no-brainer. But unfortunately, what happens in many of these cases, and I'm just going on by what other cases that have occurred, if you have a bunch of people saying, I don't want Frances Widdowson to be back at Mount Royal, the arbitrator could say, well, that doesn't look like it's going to be a very, kind of harmonious workplace that's going to exist. So I don't feel comfortable ordering the reinstatement.
Okay.
And if that happens, it's just an absolute travesty, because why should woke positions, which cannot tolerate the discussion of different points of view. That's the problem. That's the problem in the university, is that you have some people like Renee Watchman, and she makes no bones about it. She says people should not be able to argue against indigenization. That you shouldn't be allowed to do that at a university, and made some comment about white people are just too fragile and this kind of like these kinds of things. Like, why should someone like Renee Watchman be able to control what happens at a university? Like at an academic institution, unless we've given up on the academic institution and we say it's not about that anymore. It's about sort of what you were talking about, this bureaucratic
belonging,
kind of. It's our job as a university to force people to agree, because that's what kind of smooths out all the acrimonious kinds of disputes that exist around ideas at a university. The most shocking incident and this is the most shocking thing that happened, which I'm still, I had some serious psychological problems when this happened. I'm over it now, and I'm going to hold them to account. On December 20th, and this is before I got fired, this is the evening I got fired, I was invigilating an exam, my last exam, and I'd had a disciplinary meeting, the Star Chamber disciplinary meeting on December 13th, so I knew things weren't looking good for me by how that had happened.
Yeah.
But as I was doing my exam, I gathered up my exams and I was moving down the hall, and I heard this voice behind me saying, Dr. Widdowson, Dr. Widdowson. And I turned around, and this was during COVID, so we're both wearing masks. And it was Mike Quinn, who was the associate provost or vice provost, who's like next to the provost is the highest up academic position at Mount Royal. And I'd just been on a call with him that morning about a candidate for a hiring, Indigenous studies hiring. So I thought he was wanting to ask me about the candidate. So I said, "Oh, hello, hi there." And he said, "Oh, we've met before." And I said, "Yes, we have." And he said, "Do you mind just stepping in here a moment?" He said to this classroom across the hall. And as I walked into the classroom, I saw two human resources. One person I knew was a human resource person sitting at this table. And I knew that I was going to get fired at that point. I knew, and I didn't have my union represent, like whenever you have any disciplinary meeting at Mount Royal, it's known you have union representation to make sure your rights are not violated and so on. So I said at that time, I'm not doing this meeting like this. You have to send me notice, and you have to have the union representative here, or representation. And as I tried to leave, he moved in front of me and blocked the door and tried to stop me from leaving. So I, at that time, just totally lost it because I felt I had been lured into this classroom after hours. It was at 5:30 at night. No one else was around campus. And I said, "Get out of you are forcibly confining me. Get away from there." And I brushed past him. I was in this complete state. And I ran back to my office and I opened up my computer, tried to get into my computer, and it was locked down by the system. I had no union numbers or anything. I called my colleague to get the union, to call the union. And I was trying to decide what I wanted to do here. And I got my stuff together, and I should get out of here because I have to go find the union and talk to them about this and everything. I had my exams with me. I didn't want them to take my exams because I wanted the union to be involved in whatever was going to happen with respect to this. And as I tried to leave, there was Mike Quinn again outside my office. And there was this whole crowd of human resources people and two security guards at either end of the hallway. And I just totally freaked out, and I called 911 on the university, and they were trying to get me to leave my exams, and I said, "Get away from here! I am leaving! Don't touch me! Don't do anything!" And I left Mount Royal as in this completely shaken state, and
oh man,
and that was all. I recorded the next morning, the union, I sat down with the union and did a recording of my ordeal. And I still, like a number of months after that, I would be sitting somewhere and I would have this kind of thing with Mike Quinn with his mask and him blocking the door and the whole kind of just incomplete, like crazy thing.
Yeah.
And then the next day when I got my termination letter from the president, which they were trying to serve me, I guess, at that time without union representation. The actual letter said I was supposed to return my exams the next day. So I don't know why Mike Quinn was trying to wrestle these exams away from me and do all these things. And all these human resources people were there and terrorizing me, basically terrorizing me, trying to humiliate me and so on at Mount Royal. And the only thing I can think of is that they were just trying to kind of paint that I was this huge threat that had to be immediately removed, and that here I just invigilated an exam with 60 students. So if I was such a huge threat to the university and so on, why am I in this room with all these students who could be subjected to my epistemic violence and terrorism and all the things that everyone was kind of claiming I was this kind of dangerous person or something like that. But that when that happened, I thought, whoa, things are definitely gone off the rails here at the university, that they would be doing that.
And you're fine with not taking any action against the people who treated you in such a way?
Well, the police investigated, and they said, well, there was not definitely, was not right what happened, but in terms of reaching the threshold of,
hostage or whatever,
assault and whatever. And it's like they couldn't. So I could have pursued it civilly in a civil, but in the end, it's like I just want to publicize what happened. Like my own position is I don't really want my whole position from the very beginning when I started and having all these terrible problems with these people who are defaming me was I don't want people to be punished for doing these things, because I think we really need to have these discussions in the university, and the whole legal side of everything really doesn't contribute to that intellectual process. And that's one of the problems with arbitration is that, I really want the truth to come out about everything. I want everyone to have a better understanding of what's going on in universities. But arbitration has got this adversarial process where each side is trying to win. And so a lot of things are not going to come out because of that. So it's an unfortunate kind of situation where what we really need is much more discussion about everything, not more protections against certain, like trying to stop people from having things said to them and all these types of things. Like I really am quite happy to sit down with any of these people who, have these arguments about how I'm engaged in anti-Indigenous rhetoric and say, well, how is that the case? Like how I'm trying to help Indigenous people by ensuring that they receive the highest level of education possible and the same standard of education as every other student who comes to Mount Royal. But with the indigenization process, what they're trying to do is give Indigenous students a lower standard by claiming that, spiritual beliefs and Indigenous creationism is a science in some way and should be taught in the science curriculum for them, and have them go to a camp where an elder is going to, state a bunch of things which aren't true under the guise that this is somehow preserving their culture and, helping them to become more in tune with the land and so on.
Which is fine if they want to do that extracurricularly, but your argument is that this is not an academic activity.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're going to have Indigenous students going to be given that as the academic program, that's going to mean that the type of degree that they're going to get is going to be at a lower standard than the degree that other students are getting. So that's not an anti-Indigenous position. It's actually a non-racist, pro-Indigenous position, trying to ensure that Indigenous people are getting the kinds of services to which they're entitled to, but which are being constantly, undermined at every turn by Indigenous scholar activists and their quote-unquote allies, who are acting behind the scenes, who I think are the real problem. Like I really, although the Indigenous scholar activists are the ones who went after me, I don't think that was really, they were the main kinds of force behind it. I think there is a number of non-Indigenous administrators and academics who are pushing for this behind the scenes, and they just see Indigenous scholar activists as a tool that they're going to use in their attempts to kind of gain power within the institution.
And is this similar or akin to what Jim McMurtry is pointing out? The indicating by saying that the moralism that surrounds the Indigenous topic is it's a front for a political movement.
Yeah. So. The Indigenous residential schools, this is a huge, similar to, I guess, Black Lives Matter in the United States. The Indigenous residential schools now have taken on, center stage, although trans activism is still very much, I used to think that trans activism was the most, was the tip of this and the sharpest point that was being used. Perhaps it is still, but indigenization comes a pretty close second, and the residential school. So when I was going to Lethbridge and I was shut down at Lethbridge, the reason was the residential schools, and there's this term that's now being used called residential school denialism, which is being put forward by the academic Sean Carlton and also Keisha Supernant, Negon Sinclair, and Ian Mosby. Those are the most significant figures in this regard. And what they're trying to say is that it's the same as being a Holocaust denier. If you deny that the residential schools were genocidal, that's the same as you're a Holocaust denier. And of course, if you're a Holocaust denier, you're a quack, and it's not really a legitimate academic position. I'm not saying people that should be illegal or anyone should be punished for it, but I don't think, if you're going to be putting forward that position in an academic kind of forum, I don't think that would be taken seriously. Whereas the question about whether the residential schools are genocidal is a serious academic question, which has not been sorted out at all because of the ad hominem kind of response, which has happened from people like Sean Carlton. And this is attached to the political parties in Canada. So the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party especially, which has a MP by the name of Leah Gazan, who's trying to make what she calls residential school denialism, which is denying that the residential schools were genocidal. She's trying to make that a crime. And that didn't get the pushback that it should have got. Like, it did get some pushback, but people didn't immediately say this is a totalitarian impulse that is coming forward, and that's got to be beaten back in a seriously concerted way. No one really reacted to it like that. So I'm very, very worried about that. And to some extent, the Liberal Party and the NDP, their brand is really wound up with the indigenization and the residential schools, saying that they're genocidal. It's been, the subject of many kind of virtue signaling photo ops.
Is there, when you say it's a very important academic question, that is not being asked, or there's no debate being had, but is there evidence one way or the other, and where does it point to, and overall?
Well, the most interesting thing about it is in both the Gazan motion and in other instances, what the Assembly of First Nations, which is the group that represents all the Indigenous bands across the country, the example that they use that always comes out to support the idea that the residential schools were genocidal was the supposed discovery of, quote unquote, 215 unmarked graves at Kamloops, at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And so what's happened now is that there's a bunch of cemeteries across the country, and the markers that were on the graves have disintegrated. So there's a number of unmarked graves in cemeteries that exist across the country. No, there's cases where it's not known who's buried there because the markers are no longer there. So that's the issue that does exist. These kind of activists who are arguing in favor of the idea that it's genocidal are trying to imply that there's a whole bunch of clandestine burials across the country, and that has not been substantiated. And the most significant case is the Kamloops case, which is, it's claimed that there are initially 215, but then downgraded to 200 clandestine burials in an apple orchard and next to the Kamloops Indian Residential Schools. And it was claimed that children were woken up in the middle of the night to dig the graves, that a child as young as 3 years old was found buried there. Anyway, this is all a fabrication. It's all a fabrication because the only thing that we have is the ground penetrating radar, which are soil disturbances. And there's been excavations that have happened on the Kamloops site since, for 100 years, so you don't know the difference. And the downgrading of 215 to 200 happened because Sarah Beaulieu, who was the ground penetrating radar expert, found out after she made the finding of 215 anomalies that 15 of those anomalies were already accounted for in an excavation that had been done by the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University, which raises the question, if she thought that those 15 soil disturbances were unmarked graves, why wouldn't the other 200 also be of similar excavations and not have any graves in them either? And it's highly improbable that there are these burials because we have no parent who has ever said a child never came home from the Kamloops Indian residential school. So if there are 200 clandestine burials there, where are the missing children that never came home from the Kamloops Indian residential school?
Isn't it easy to just go there and dig some holes?
Yeah, well, that's the argument. So we don't even need to have that happen yet. The biggest thing that's happened is that Sarah Beaulieu did a report of her ground penetrating radar study. That report, they will not release, the ban will not release to the public. And so the demand is release that report. As well, the RCMP, when they heard about this, opened up an investigation about it in May 2021. This was interfered with by Murray Sinclair, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, and he kind of implied that the RCMP was acting improperly by questioning Sarah Beaulieu about her report, which obviously you would do if you were an RCMP investigator. And as well, the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University is under a gag order by the lawyer of the Kamloops band not to talk about the unmarked graves.
Why?
Kamloops.
Because it's dishonorable to the families or disrespectful to the families?
They haven't said why.
Oh, okay.
So that's the other thing is you have Simon Fraser University Archaeology Department. It's a publicly funded institution. Why is a publicly funded institution being controlled by an Indigenous group? How come this is happening? And then in the end, the only way you're going to find anything out for sure is by doing the excavations. But the bands are very resistant to this. They're claiming, of course, that this goes against their cultural kind of traditions, and that I even heard this journalist Brandy Moran saying, the spirits of the murdered children will weep if you excavate. This kind of language.
So we should make it a hate crime to investigate further.
This is where it's going. But obviously, there's no upside to excavating because we already have the whole country believing that genocide has occurred because of this mass grave of 215 murdered children, which is like not even close to anything that's going to be found like that. If anything, probably nothing is going to be found because they're going to find that all those septic tiles that were dug in 1927, which is a lot of disturbances and a lot of trenches and everything like that, those are going to show very similarly to unmarked graves. That's the kind of thing we're likely are going to find. And why would the band want to excavate with that possibility that is going to come up? And then all sorts of finger pointing and things happening saying, how did we ever get led down this garden path and have the whole country in mourning for, 6 months because everyone thought there was this mass grave of murdered children and on and on and on and on. It was a very calculated, orchestrated attempt by the band to control information about all of this to buttress their claim for genocide so that they could then extract all sorts of reparations on this basis. So this is a huge national scandal that no one really wants to kind of not to excuse the pun, dig into and uncover, because there's going to be a lot of embarrassed people about it.
Is the truth not going to come to light, you think, or is it?
No, not under the current thing. I'm working currently with a group of about 20 researchers, the most important being an intrepid IF Stone figure called Nina Green, who has done all sorts of research on the question of these unmarked graves in Canada. And it is just a completely fabricated situation where, and it's not to deny that there are unmarked graves. There are many unmarked graves across the country. And in fact, there was a report done for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission done by someone by the last name of Hamilton, which said, yes, there are these cemeteries with unmarked graves, and we should be working to try to find out who was in, like, that's okay, fine, important question. Like, who was buried in the cemetery and so on, fine. And people are concerned about, where their grandmother and so on was buried. But that's not the same as the clandestine burial ground claim. So those two things have to be very, very separated, distinctively separated. But people like Keisha Supernant, who's this supposed ground penetrating radar expert, she uses this. She goes back and forth. It's in the you probably heard of it. It's called the Mott and Bailey strategy. The Bailey is the kind of the controversial claim that you make that people are not sure about, and then the Mott is it's an uncontroversial. Everyone accepts that. Everyone accepts the unmarked graves and cemeteries claim, but the thing about the clandestine burials is not been substantiated at all. But when you say, hey, there's no evidence of clandestine burials, they say, well, there's lots of these unmarked graves and cemeteries. It's like, well, that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about the clandestine burials, which there's no evidence at all for that. And it's highly improbable because we don't have these kinds of incidents where someone just went missing from a residential school. In fact, there was a lot of monitoring of students that happened in residential schools, although some of the records historically might have been lost. But, at the time, they had to write quarterly reports into the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. These Indian agents and everything would be saying, hey, well, what happened to Johnny? Like, where's Johnny? That would have been happening, and that was not happening. So it just is amazing that this is occurring.
Are they accusing or asking, or I guess, accusing of a cover up? That whenever they run into missing data, they say, well, it's probably just covered up. These deaths were covered up. It's sort of insinuated that that's the case. But if you can't definitively prove genocide, but you want to make disproving genocide illegal and a crime, like wouldn't you? It seems so transparently a power grab that the only reason it's being humored is out of politeness and political expediency.
Yeah, I think, and I talk to people about this a lot, and people will say things who aren't, argue, look, we have to get to the bottom of this. If you're trying to say that, people say Indigenous people suffered during the residential schools. Why are you opening up this wound? Let them be, but it's like, well, do you want them to think that there were this mass grave of 215 children in Kamloops when there isn't that going to be a terrible wound that people are going to be dealing with? The second thing I should mention, besides the use of things like Kamloops to buttress the genocide claim, what also happened, and I think this was very strategic as well, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made a finding of what it called cultural genocide in its report.
Yeah.
And I was always opposed to the use of the words cultural genocide because I thought it was combining two very different things together, which I didn't like them being conflated. And it really would be, the appropriate term would be culture side, the killing of a culture. if you're going to be, so
Okay.
you could say, you could make the argument that the residential schools in various instances, not all, because often, especially in the later years, the residential schools didn't have this harsh approach to trying to stop Indigenous languages from being spoken. But there were schools that did that, and there were arguments that were made that I've seen quite often where government officials would say, we don't want those children returning to their parents during the summertime because they go back into those communities and they lose all the kind of cultural gains that they made in the schools, which we need them to have if they're going to be able to operate in modern society, or they would say the white man's world or something like that. So you had remote, dispersed nomadic types of communities or semi-nomadic communities that would take the children out on hunting parties for months at a time. Mm-hmm. And the children would come back and they'd sort of forgotten everything that they'd learned in the school. So there was this kind of idea of intentional separation so that, the new values and skills and aptitudes could be ingrained within the children. And you could, like, I could see people referring to that as the killing of culture side, right? But the people that were doing that thought this was the way in which they were going to help Indigenous people not, die from being unable to find a livelihood and so on, which is sort of the problem is that the fur trade had collapsed. So the old way of living was no longer going to be in operation.
Okay, yeah.
But using the words cultural genocide made one think that this was somewhat similar to the intentional extermination of a group of people. And so what happened, and I think this was strategic, once they got the cultural genocide language ingrained within people's thought process, then they just removed the word cultural from it. And so now people are just using the word genocide and not cultural genocide. And using the word genocide, when people think about what genocide means, it means the intentional extermination of a group of people like that. And there was not an intentional extermination of a group of people. There was an attempt to assimilate Indigenous people into Canadian society. Now, we can argue now that was a mistaken process and so on, but it doesn't have the same draconian kind of force as the word genocide does. And I think this is all done for the purposes of escalating the harms that are claimed to have happened. And the more harms that you can kind of get people to admit, the more reparations you're going to be able to extract on that basis.
Yeah, so there's the reparations that go to the nominally go to the tribes or the bands, but then there's also a sort of mind control that gets to be exerted by your liberal government, in the same vein as what happened after World War II in Germany. And then after the ending of the Cold War, where East and West Germany came together and they kind of made a collective story that bound them together in shame around the Holocaust. They made a Holocaust museum, and then they accepted their shame, which gave them moral superiority, and then allows them to silent dissent of any sort of national pride, any sort of ethnic, not even ethnic purity, but any sort of limiting of immigration, and any sort of argument against the government and the government's problem can really easily put you into the Holocaust denier thing or into the fascist kind of party. So it's a great tool for your liberal government to have to be able to shame the white populace into obedience of its ever encroaching, narrowing of their pride, self-determination, independence, etc.
It's very, and I still don't know, like I'm trying to work through what's going on here as to, part of it is, I think, limitations on speech generally. Like we're entering into a period like I personally, and I'm very, very, very worried about where we're going here. I think we are entering into a kind of a period of quasi-fascism. Like I think we're and the speech. This is the first thing that goes in these kinds of developments is that you kind of pretend there's some kind of national emergency, or perhaps, or as well you say that there's all this hatred that is being expressed, and we got to clamp down on that because there's violence that's and when you look at, okay, well, what's the substantiation for that? You do have neo-Nazi groups in Canada like you have in any modern society. Like, it's always like been a feature, but this is not a dominant thread of Canadian society. I don't see there's a huge menace that has to be curbed in some way. And even if there were, I would be very, very reluctant to say we should be making speech illegal, because I don't think that is how to resolve these matters. I think unless you're going to have an actual threat that you are making again, and it's not just a joke of some kind. It's an actual, let's go and kill a bunch of group X or something. Then I think we should, as a society, try to figure out ways to critically engage and to try to defeat the ideas and so on. That should be what we are doing. But what we're seeing more and more is no. We've got to clamp down on things. We've got to prevent this from happening because we're in this kind of crisis kind of mode. I don't understand all the nationalist. It's possible, and that you see this in the United States more than you see this in Canada, but it's something that's probably going to happen here too, is you have two kinds of fractions of the capitalist class, I guess I would see. Because I come at this often from the historical materialist standpoint, is my own view, which comes out of the Marxist kind of position. I'm not a ideologue, so I always sort of try and figure it out scientifically as opposed to, like trying to
idealistically.
Yeah, I do it theoretically as opposed to kind of activism and so on. Okay. But there's the international type of capitalist class, and then there's the national type of capitalist class. So the Donald Trump and all that's kind of associated, that would be national capitalist class. So, and whatever industries and so on are associated with national kinds of interests, they would be to some extent in conflict with the internationalist capitalist class. And I think Trudeau, like the Liberals, are very much international capitalist class types, it seems to me. And the Conservatives probably would be more nationalist capitalist class. So they're trying to break down any kind of national affiliation and get us to see ourselves more as part of, being in line with the EU and NATO and all this kind of international kind of capitalist bloc, which is kind of pitted against Russia and China and that sort of thing. Right? Anyway, so I think that's a bit what this is very theoretical and very...
Yeah. But it would be very useful for the international Canadian ruling class to stigmatize any sort of national pride or to use genocide to weaken people's personal bonds to this faulty Canadian country. We might as well be a part of the world and move beyond our past sins. Yeah.
And Google and Amazon and those are all internationalist capitalist class, like that type of thing. It is very much like that. And that's where you see wokism the strongest. In those, the more internationalist, the capitalist, and I was just this talk that I was just listening to this morning, which is excellent, by the National Association of Scholars about diversity, diversity as a managerial ideology, and so on, and woke. The term he used, woke capital.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because I hadn't really heard the term woke capital before. So woke capitalists. Google.
Yeah.
Facebook,
any single corporation that has a rainbow logo for 1 month out of the year.
So the rainbow thing, and really, I think that the trans activism is the most woke of all the woke causes.
Why do you think that?
Because I think it's the most subjective. So postmodernism is you replace objective search for truth with these subjective beliefs. Trans is like the most subjective because it's just all what you feel. And now with the what is it, 100 gender identities and so on, like this is what, and your gender identity this morning might not even be the same as your gender identity this afternoon. Because you could just subjectively change, and it's up to me as a professor every time I go into a class, and perhaps I should be checking on it on a minute-to-minute basis, because could just be changed every minute. So this is like incredible subjectivity that goes on. And I should mention a great thinker who never gets, he's not even known, who's just really amazed me with his trans activism analysis. His name is Christopher Nagel. He wrote a book called The Secular Fundamentalist. Anyway, he's not known, but I interacted with him on the trans question. Anyway, he says it's the ultimate in fantasy. So people's fantasy, realizing your fantasy. Mm-hmm. And he says this is very symptomatic of this kind of indulgence capitalism kind of period we're in, where people are encouraged to just pursue whatever identity that they have come up with. And it's up to the rest of us to affirm that identity. Mm-hmm. And if we don't affirm that identity, then we are at a genocide. Like this is being used with the trans logic.
Genocide, yeah.
Is that if you oppose drag queens speaking to children, which, I think there's an argument to be made about that. Like, I don't know why the drag queens want to go in to speak to children. It's a sexual kind of performance. Why do you want to do that? Why aren't you in a bar somewhere, whatever? Yeah. Like I'm not trying to say don't do that. I'm saying
that's one question. The other question is why parents are so into bringing their kids to these things, because parents are getting more and more into doing this for some sort of weird subversive reason. I know.
And again, it's this weird narcissistic indulgent sort of thing. Color, you may have heard of this coloring books for adults.
Oh, really?
Why are adults coloring in coloring books? And like this is like an infantilization, going back to we can't grow up. Where it's like a Peter Pan.
Yeah.
I just want to do whatever I want, and I don't want anyone to criticize me for all my things. Instead of, okay, we are seeing rapidly a breakdown of society because we don't have any disciplines or structures or anything about how to, reproduce the next generation. Like these are huge kind of existential problems. But anyway, trans is the most woke of all the woke kind of stuff because it is the most subjective of all the identities, and it is the most of the indulgence kind of fantasy, type of thing. And Christopher Nagel, in his great piece, which I don't know if it still exists or not, but it was about trans activism in Australia. And he refers to this as the jewel wasp of indulgence capitalism.
What's a jewel wasp?
And this is a great one here, which I was really struck by this metaphor, is there's a parasitic wasp, which is called the emerald jewel wasp. And the jewel wasp is a predatory wasp that feeds off of cockroaches. And the cockroach is relatively large in comparison to the jewel wasp. And the jewel wasp, what it has to do is it has to lobotomize the cockroach. And it does this by putting venom into the cockroach's brain. And then once it's lobotomized the cockroach, it walks the cockroach back to its nest using its antennae, the cockroach antennae, as a leash, and then gets the cockroach in its lobotomized state into the nest, and then lays its eggs on the cockroach. So, according to Nagel, the venom is postmodernism. So what happens is that we are being, with all this wokism and stuff, we're being lobotomized. So we have no defense. Like, so we've got to accept drag queens coming in to read to our children because we're lobotomized, and we're just saying, well, anything goes. And, you know, if I don't, I'm a transphobe and an oppressive person. Why would I be opposing, sort of sexualized, strange, gender bending kinds of rituals happening in front of my children? In fact, I'm going to seem like I'm a great person and a celebrator of difference and identities if I, in fact, go out and promote it and try and increase it. So it's very disturbing sort of seeing this, and then no one being able to combat it because you sense, talking about it is going to get you into trouble, into deep trouble. And that's what the whole attempts to make it illegal are, like that now, like me being concerned about drag queens reading to children, that's going to amount to advocating genocide against trans people, which genocide advocation should be a crime. So therefore, now we've got all these laws in place to stop us from talking about things which very much need to be talked about and very much need to have a critical lens being deployed against this.
So who's the wasp in the scenario?
Woke. It's the woke, or wokism is the wasp.
Okay. Or
so we're the cockroach.
Yeah.
Or society. It's kind of like our society is the cockroach, and wokism is laying its eggs into society, and of course the eggs then devour the cockroach.
Yeah. They
grow up, the larvae and everything. So it's kind of a bit of a grotesque kind of imaginary, but I think that's kind of what we're dealing with here is a very, very destructive force that we're welcoming into our nest. Like we're welcoming these kinds of things. Well, that's not particularly helpful because it's the jewel wasp nest that it is, but we're welcoming into our body politic, this very, very destructive force that is going to prevent us from figuring out how to go forward in the world. Like, we have serious problems that we need to figure out, but we can't figure them out because we're lobotomized, and our universities are the biggest. We're the most lobotomized, and in fact, we're acting like the jewel wasp and lobotomizing everyone else. Like because of our idiotic kinds of ideas that we're just dispersing into society and not encouraging people to think critically about everything that's happening.
Well, Frances, thanks for sharing your story. I'm sorry you've been on such a wild ride.
Yeah, well, I think although it's been very upsetting, obviously, I think that because I'm well positioned to fight this battle. Like as I've got a lot of support, not always, that vocal. I don't think I've done anything wrong. I've probably done a few things wrong here and there, but in terms of the whole big picture, I don't want to hide anything. I'm happy for everything that I've done, everything that I've said. Hey, take a look at that and see if there is something where I've made a mistake here and then okay, well, I can say, okay, I shouldn't have said that or whatever. But in terms of the grand scheme of things, my case is exposing the fact that certain ideas cannot be discussed in a university. And if you think that a university is about encouraging people to say what they think is true, which is what I thought universities were supposed to be about, that is under serious threat And if people don't take this seriously and fight against it, our universities are over. And that's why I think my case is so important, is that there is really no reason why I shouldn't be reinstated at Mount Royal. And any kind of argument against it is just, pure wokism, which is the actual cause of the destruction of the universities, of which my case is one kind of particularly sorry chapter.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down on who can hold who accountable. And insofar as the justice system is still uncaptured, or at least nominally neutral, then that's one aegis or barrier or net against this. Yeah.
Yes. And that's the most frightening thing, I guess, is the courts are not far off.
Nope.
So in Canada, we had a decision on freedom of expression. It was called the Ward case. And it was decided 5-4 in favor of freedom of expression. So we've got one. Wow. We're one Supreme Court justice away from the whole system falling apart in Canada. So it's just scary when you see that, because we need the courts to hold the line on, equality under the law and the rule of law and all the sort of rights and freedoms and so on that we are protecting. And that is not far off. So that's probably the most frightening aspect of wokeism.
Wow. Who would have thought?
Yep.
Well, Frances, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to wrap up the podcast now. It's great talking to you. Great meeting you. And I'll be sure to link people to all of your resources online so they can keep abreast of your situation and hear some funky audio.
Thanks very much. And for people who are very interested in the endgame of wokism, you should definitely watch Benjamin's The Complete Evergreen Story, 24 episodes. I've watched it twice, and I'll probably watch it a third time. I can't recommend that highly enough.
Thank you. Yeah. And by end of wokism, like the end game or the end state, not necessarily, not that it's ending by any means.
End game. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.